Picture two German soldiers, both 23 years old, both conscripted into a war they didn't start, both facing the same inevitable moment. Hands raised, weapon dropped, surrender accepted. The first stands in the smoking ruins of Stalingrad, February 1943, watching Soviet soldiers approach through the skeletal remains of what was once a city. His breath creates small clouds in air so cold it burns his lungs. The second kneels in the North African desert 3 months later, sand in his boots, watching American soldiers emerge from dust clouds kicked up by their vehicles. The Mediterranean sun beats down mercilessly. Same war, same army, same outcome. But these two men might as well have surrendered on different planets, because geography, pure arbitrary geography, was about to determine whether they lived or died. One direction meant a 93% chance of death. The other meant a 99.75% chance of survival. This isn't speculation. This isn't propaganda from either side. These are the documented, verified statistics of what happened to over 3 million German prisoners of war captured by different Allied powers during World War II. What follows is the story of how the compass direction of your capture could mean the difference between hell and something approaching mercy, between deliberate extermination and careful preservation, between being treated as disposable waste or as human beings protected by international law. It's a story that asks uncomfortable questions about victory, justice, and revenge, about what powerful nations owe to powerless enemies, about the true test of civilization when all restraints are removed. Let's begin where so many German soldiers' stories ended, in the frozen wasteland that Stalingrad had become. The Battle of Stalingrad consumed nearly 6 months, from August 1942 to February 1943. When it finally ended, the German Sixth Army had been systematically destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus walked into captivity on January 31, 1943, newly promoted by Hitler in a cynical last-minute gesture meant to shame him into suicide rather than surrender. The Wehrmacht tradition held that no German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Hitler thought the promotion would force Paulus to maintain that record with a bullet. Paulus chose life instead. 2 days later, 91,000 German soldiers followed him into Soviet hands. These weren't the robust, confident troops who'd invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. These were hollow-eyed wraiths who'd been slowly starving for months while fighting in conditions that redefined human suffering. They'd eaten their horses weeks ago. Then they'd boiled leather boots for whatever nutrition could be extracted. Some had resorted to cannibalism, a fact carefully documented in Soviet reports but rarely discussed in Western histories. Many couldn't walk without assistance. Frostbite had claimed fingers, toes, entire limbs. Dysentery ran rampant through their lines. Men were so weak they could barely carry their own weapons. And now, they were prisoners. What happened next would shock even veterans of the Eastern Front, where atrocity had become routine. Soviet soldiers immediately began systematic stripping of anything valuable. This wasn't battlefield looting in the traditional sense. This was organized confiscation. Winter coats, desperately needed by the Germans in sub-zero temperatures, were taken and distributed to Soviet troops. Boots vanished from German feet. Watches were pulled from wrists. Wedding rings pried from fingers. Men who resisted this process were shot without ceremony or record. Then came the marches. Without medical screening, without rest, without preparation of any kind, 91,000 starving, frozen, diseased men were forced to walk dozens of kilometers through the frozen steppe towards transit camps. Imagine it. You've survived months of the most savage urban combat in human history. You've watched your friends die from bullets, shells, starvation, and cold. You've endured temperatures that dropped below -30 degrees Celsius while fighting Soviet soldiers who were defending their homeland with desperate ferocity. You finally surrender, thinking the nightmare has ended. Instead, it's just beginning. The marches killed thousands in the first days. Men simply collapsed and didn't rise. The guards didn't need to shoot them. The cold was far more efficient. Bodies lined the roads, freezing solid within minutes of death. Eventually, other prisoners stopped trying to help fallen comrades. There was no point. Stopping meant dying yourself. The destinations were places with names that would become synonymous with death. Beketova, Krasnoarmeysk, Voroponovo. These transit camps were collection points, barely organized spaces with minimal shelter and no infrastructure capable of supporting human life. Beketova deserves special attention because it became representative of the entire Soviet POW system's brutality. The camp consisted of damaged buildings and dugouts. No proper medical facilities existed. Water came from the Volga River, contaminated with corpses from the recent battle. Latrines were open pits that quickly overflowed, creating sanitation nightmares. Food arrived irregularly, pieces of bread thrown into crowds of desperate men. Disease spread like wildfire through populations weakened by malnutrition. Dysentery, typhus, spotted fever. Men died by the hundreds daily. Within 6 months of the Stalingrad surrender, approximately 85,000 of the 91,000 Germans were dead. Read that again. 85,000 dead out of 91,000. Only 6,000 would survive long enough to eventually return to Germany, most not until the 1950s, more than a decade after the war ended. Now shift your attention westward and forward by 3 months. May 1943, Tunisia, North Africa. The Afrika Korps, Germany's elite desert fighting force under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had been systematically pushed back across North Africa by combined British and American forces. The campaign that had once threatened Cairo and the Suez Canal was collapsing. Approximately 275,000 Axis soldiers, Germans and Italians, surrendered to Allied forces in Tunisia. This included some of Germany's most experienced and professional soldiers, men who'd fought across thousands of miles of desert, men who'd earned grudging respect from their British opponents through years of back-and-forth campaigning. The moment of surrender itself set the tone for everything that followed. American soldiers processing German prisoners followed Geneva Convention protocols with almost bureaucratic precision. Every prisoner received a medical inspection. Wounded men were immediately transferred to aid stations. Everyone received water, precious in the desert. Food followed quickly. Personal effects were cataloged, not stolen. The International Red Cross was immediately notified of captures, ensuring that families would eventually learn their relatives were alive. German officers who spoke English found themselves in conversations, actual conversations, with American counterparts, about tactics, about the war, about home. One German lieutenant later wrote in his diary, "We expected harsh treatment at minimum, execution at worst. Instead, an American corporal offered me a cigarette and asked where I learned English. He told me I'd studied in London before the war. He said his grandfather came from Germany. We talked about Berlin. It was surreal." But the real shock came with the food. American military rations in 1943 included white bread, real coffee, canned meat, vegetables, fruit, chocolate, and cigarettes. This was standard fare for American troops, and by Geneva Convention requirements, prisoners received equivalent rations. German soldiers, accustomed to years of wartime shortages and military rations, couldn't process the abundance. They literally made themselves sick eating too much too quickly after months of inadequate food in North Africa. Coffee, real coffee, not the grain-based ersatz coffee common in Germany, appeared unlimited,
white bread instead of black bread, actual meat rather than occasional scraps, fresh fruit. Multiple prisoners recorded similar reactions: disbelief, confusion, suspicion that this was propaganda or temporary. Surely this abundance couldn't be genuine. Surely it wouldn't last. It lasted. The processing camps in North Africa maintained these standards throughout the prisoners' stay. Medical personnel treated wounds and illnesses. Dental care was provided. Prisoners received clean clothing, regular showers, and proper sanitation facilities. Then came the transportation phase, and here again the contrast with Soviet treatment becomes stark. Moving hundreds of thousands of prisoners from North Africa to permanent camps required massive logistical operations. How each side accomplished this task reveals fundamental philosophical differences. German prisoners bound for America traveled on Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that were backbone of Allied logistics. While these weren't passenger liners, they provided basic human accommodation: bunks, regular meals, sanitation facilities, and medical care. The Atlantic crossing took approximately 2 weeks. Prisoners received 3 meals daily. They had access to deck time for fresh air and exercise. Ship's doctors treated seasickness and monitored health conditions. Security was maintained, but prisoners were treated as human cargo, requiring care, not disposable freight. Upon reaching American ports, primarily Boston, Norfolk, and New York, prisoners got their first glimpse of a country whose industrial capacity was winning the war. The nighttime arrival in New York Harbor became legendary among prisoners. Every light was blazing. The city sparkled with electricity. Buildings towered into the sky. Ships crowded the harbor. Everything radiated prosperity and power. This contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had told them about America. They'd been assured that America was weak, racially degenerate, financially collapsing, industrially inadequate. The evidence before their eyes told a different story. One prisoner recorded, "We thought we were seeing propaganda, that they were putting on a show for our benefit. Then we realized this was just a Tuesday night in America. This abundance was normal for them. We'd been fed lies about everything." German prisoners traveling to Soviet camps experienced something entirely different. Soviet transportation of prisoners utilized the same rail infrastructure that supported the Gulag system: unheated cattle cars designed for freight, not humans. Prisoners were packed so densely they had to take turns sitting. No toilet facilities existed beyond holes cut in the floor or designated corners. Water came irregularly, sometimes thrown through the doors while the train was moving. Food arrived even less predictably. Guards maintained security through brutality rather than organization. One survivor testified, "We began with 5,000 men at the railhead. By the time we reached the camp, perhaps 3,500 remained. The others died during transport, from exposure, from disease, from exhaustion, from despair. Their bodies were simply thrown from the moving trains. The journey itself became part of the killing process. The Soviets weren't trying to keep prisoners alive during transport. They were moving them as efficiently as possible while accepting that significant numbers would die en route. This wasn't accidental. This was calculated." The physical design of POW camps reveals more about captors' intentions than any official policy statement. Architecture doesn't lie. American camps were purpose-built facilities designed to meet Geneva Convention standards while providing security. Let me describe several representative examples. Camp Hearn in Texas occupied 680 acres and housed up to 4,800 prisoners in 3 separate compounds. Each compound contained wooden barracks with electricity, running water, and heating systems. The camp included a hospital, recreational facilities, a chapel, and educational buildings. Camp Concordia in Kansas featured 304 buildings spread across similar acreage. It included a 177-bed hospital with surgical capabilities, dental clinics, a library, recreational halls, and workshops. The sewage system and electrical grid met American civilian standards. Camp Aliceville in Alabama, one of the largest camps in the southeastern United States, housed 6,000 prisoners with infrastructure that exceeded many American military bases: hot water, modern sanitation, well-ventilated barracks, professional kitchens. German prisoners arriving at these camps experienced cognitive dissonance. Many had better living conditions than in their own military barracks back in Germany. The contrast with wartime Germany, where Allied bombing had destroyed housing and infrastructure, was jarring. These camps weren't luxurious, but they were humane. They communicated a message. You are defeated enemies, but you are human beings entitled to dignity under international law. Soviet camps communicated a very different message. The GUPVI system, Main Administration for Affairs of Prisoners of War and Internees, operated as an extension of the Gulag. These were economic production units that happened to use prisoner labor. Camps spread across the Soviet Union's vast territory, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the deserts of Central Asia. Near Stalingrad, camps like Beketova served as collection points. In Siberia, camps like Cherny, NKVD Special Camp No. 48, housed senior officers in relative isolation. The massive Karaganda complex in Kazakhstan sprawled across 1.78 million hectares, with theoretical capacity for 65,000 prisoners. But capacity numbers meant nothing when facilities couldn't support human life. Barracks were often unheated structures or even dugouts, holes in the ground covered with whatever materials were available. No running water, no proper sanitation, no heating beyond what prisoners could improvise, no medical facilities worthy of the name. The architecture said, "You are resources to be exploited. Your survival is irrelevant to your purpose." Prisoners lived in these conditions while performing hard labor in extreme climates, logging in Siberian forests where temperatures reached -40 degrees Celsius, mining operations without safety equipment, construction projects with minimal tools and maximum quotas. The camps weren't designed to kill prisoners outright. That would be inefficient. They were designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum support. Death was an expected outcome, not a failure of the system. How prisoners spent their days reveals the fundamental difference between detention and exploitation, between imprisonment and enslavement. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, the daily schedule followed military patterns designed to maintain order while respecting prisoner dignity. 6 a.m., roll call. 6:30 a.m., breakfast, hot cereal, bread, butter, jam, coffee. 8 a.m., work details depart for agricultural labor or camp maintenance. 12 p.m., lunch, meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread. 5 p.m., return from work. 5:30 p.m., dinner. 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., free time, recreation, education, correspondence. 10 p.m., lights out. Food rations matched those provided to American garrison troops, approximately 3,300 calories daily. This included 1 pound of meat per day, unlimited bread, fresh vegetables when seasonally available, dairy products, coffee with sugar, and occasional treats. Think about that. German prisoners in American camps ate better than German civilians or even German soldiers still fighting. Medical care was comprehensive. Each camp had hospitals staffed by both American doctors and German medical personnel. Prisoners received treatment for injuries, illnesses, dental problems. American doctors introduced German medical staff to innovations like penicillin, not yet widely available in Germany. Prisoners could pursue education. Camps offered classes in English, mathematics, technical skills, arts. Some prisoners completed university-level courses through correspondence programs. Libraries stocked thousands of books in German and English. Recreation included sports leagues, theatrical productions, musical performances, art classes. Some camps had better cultural programs than many American towns. This wasn't pampering. This was adherence to international law and recognition of human dignity. Soviet camps operated on entirely different principles. 4 a.m., summer, or 5 a.m., winter. Wake up. Breakfast,
hot water with grain, 200 grams of bread. Work, 10 to 16 hours depending on season and project urgency. Minimal break for thin soup. Evening, return to barracks, evening ration. Sleep. Work dominated existence. Logging operations required prisoners to cut and process specific quantities of timber daily. Mining operations set quotas for ore extraction. Construction brigades had daily targets for building projects. Meeting quotas determined rations. Prisoners who fulfilled requirements received full rations, 300 to 400 grams of bread, often adulterated with sawdust, watery soup with occasional vegetables, minimal fat or protein. Total, perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 calories. This was half what human bodies need for survival without physical labor. With hard labor in extreme conditions, it was a slow death sentence. Prisoners who couldn't meet quotas received reduced rations. This created a death spiral. Inadequate food meant less energy meant lower productivity meant even less food. The mathematics were deliberate. Soviet administrators calculated that extracting maximum labor before death was more efficient than maintaining prisoner health for long-term productivity. Medical care was minimal to non-existent. Camps had infirmaries, bare rooms where the sick were isolated from the working population. Treatment consisted mainly of rest. No medications, no surgery, no dental care. Men died from conditions easily treatable in American camps, like infections, appendicitis, tooth abscesses.
Recreation didn't exist. Free time was spent trying to stay warm, mend clothing, or simply rest. Cultural activities were impossible when every calorie went towards survival. The ability to communicate with loved ones profoundly affects prisoner psychology and survival. The presence or absence of mail reveals whether captors viewed prisoners as human beings with families or as disposable resources. American camps maintained regular postal service through international Red Cross channels. Prisoners could write 2 letters and 4 postcards monthly. While censored for military information, personal content flowed freely. Mail traveled through neutral Switzerland, taking 2 to 3 months each direction, but arriving reliably. Families could respond with letters and care packages containing food, clothing, books, photographs, small luxuries. This connection to home provided psychological sustenance that sustained morale through years of captivity. Knowing your family knew you were alive, knowing they could write to you, knowing you'd eventually return to them. Letters from American camps carried news of daily life, assurances of well-being, hopes for the future. Prisoners could maintain relationships with wives, watch children grow through photographs, comfort aging parents, stay connected to communities they'd left behind. Soviet camps imposed communication blackout that lasted years. Initially, prisoners couldn't send or receive mail at all. The Soviet Union refused to provide prisoner lists to the International Red Cross. They declined to notify families of captures. For years, millions of German families had no information about their relatives' fates. Eventually, usually after 1947, limited communication became possible. Prisoners could send 1 postcard monthly, 25 words on pre-printed forms. These cards took months to arrive if they arrived at all. Incoming mail was even more restricted. But the initial blackout did maximum psychological damage. Wives aged without knowing if their husbands were alive or dead. Children grew up without fathers, not knowing if they were war orphans or had parents somewhere in the Soviet vastness. Parents died waiting for sons who might or might not exist anymore. This blackout was deliberate policy. The Soviets didn't want the world knowing what was happening in their camps. They didn't want accurate prisoner counts. They didn't want witnesses. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical deprivation. Men survived brutal conditions through hope of eventual return to families. Remove that hope, or even just the certainty that families knew you existed, and survival becomes harder. Both American and Soviet systems used prisoner labor, but implementation revealed everything about their different philosophies. American POW labor operated under strict Geneva Convention guidelines. Prisoners could not be forced to work in dangerous conditions or on military projects directly supporting the war effort. Officers were entirely exempt from labor requirements. Enlisted men worked standard 8-hour days, with Sundays and holidays free. By 1944, over 300,000 German POWs worked across the American economy. They harvested sugar beets in Colorado, picked cotton in Texas and Arizona, maintained forests in Oregon and Washington, worked in canneries throughout the country, and helped with construction projects in growing cities. This program addressed critical labor shortages caused by American men serving in the military. It provided prisoners with productive activity rather than idleness, and it paid wages, 80 cents daily, equivalent to an American private's pay. While paid in camp scrip rather than cash, this money had value. Prisoners purchased items from camp stores: toiletries, snacks, writing materials, cigarettes, magazines. They could save money for eventual repatriation. Work conditions were often remarkably good. Farmers who employed prisoner labor treated them as temporary farmhands. Prisoners ate lunch with farming families, learned American agricultural techniques, operated expensive equipment. One Nebraska farmer told researchers, "Those German boys worked harder than the American help I'd had before the war. I trusted them with my tractors, my livestock, my crops. Never had a problem." Prisoners sometimes developed genuine friendships with American employers. Some maintained correspondence after repatriation. A few eventually immigrated to America and settled near farms where they'd worked as prisoners. This wasn't exploitation. It was employment under legal constraints with fair compensation. Soviet labor programs were slavery by another name. Prisoners worked because failure to work meant death. They performed the most dangerous, difficult labor the Soviet economy required: logging in extreme cold, mining without protective equipment, construction in harsh conditions. Siberian logging operations killed thousands through exposure and exhaustion. Prisoners worked in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius with minimal protective clothing. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, limbs. Men who couldn't continue working were left to die. Mining proved particularly lethal. Uranium mines without protective equipment exposed prisoners to radiation. Coal mines prone to collapse buried men alive. Metal mines in Kazakhstan operated under quotas that guaranteed casualties. Construction brigades built Soviet infrastructure with prisoner blood: roads across the steppes, buildings in new industrial cities, rail lines through frozen tundra. Every project had its associated cemetery. The economic calculation was explicit: extract maximum labor before death. Don't invest in prisoner health or safety because the supply of prisoners seemed unlimited. Guards enforced quotas through brutality: beatings for slow work, reduced rations for incomplete tasks, isolation for perceived resistance, summary execution for serious infractions. Work wasn't employment. It was a killing mechanism, slower than bullets, but nearly as effective. Numbers don't lie. They can't be argued with. They revealed truth that propaganda cannot conceal. Of approximately 425,000 German POWs held in American camps throughout the war, between 850 and 1,000 died. That's a mortality rate below 0.25%. Deaths resulted from accidents, natural causes, disease, and violence between prisoners, including 135 documented murders by Nazi loyalists targeting prisoners who cooperated with Americans or were suspected of communist sympathies. American authorities investigated every death. Families were notified. Bodies were buried with military honors. Records were kept. Soviet custody statistics tell a catastrophically different story. Soviet records acknowledge 381,607 German Wehrmacht deaths among 2,388,000 registered prisoners. However, the Moschke Commission, established by the West German government to investigate prisoner fates, documented far higher numbers: 1,094,250 deaths among approximately 3.060 million German prisoners. Historian Rüdiger Overmans, after exhaustive research, estimates total deaths between 1 and 1.1 million. Let's be clear about what these numbers mean. Roughly 1 out of every 3 German soldiers captured by Soviet forces died in captivity. The Stalingrad prisoners fared worst. Of 91,000 captured in February 1943, approximately 85,000 died within 6 months. Only 5,000 to 6,000 survived to eventual repatriation. That's a 93% mortality rate. Compare that to the 0.25% mortality rate in American camps. Same nationality of prisoners, same war, same general time period. But if you surrendered east instead of west, you were 372 times more likely to die. These aren't estimates. These are carefully documented facts compiled by multiple independent sources over decades of research.
How and when prisoners returned home reveals final truths about their captors' intentions. American repatriation began within weeks of Germany's surrender in May 1945. Processing moved quickly but deliberately. Before departure, all prisoners viewed mandatory films of concentration camp liberations. This was calculated policy. American authorities wanted German POWs to understand what their government had done, to see Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, to witness the industrial machinery of genocide. The films had profound effects. At Camp Butner, North Carolina, 1,000 prisoners spontaneously burned their uniforms after watching liberation footage. Many experienced genuine shock. They'd believed Nazi propaganda about work camps rather than death camps. By December 1946, virtually all German POWs had left American camps and returned to Germany. The American goal was clear: process them, educate them about Nazi crimes, send them home. Total American detention averaged 18 to 24 months. Soviet repatriation followed completely different patterns. The first releases in 1945 consisted of invalids whose labor value didn't justify feeding costs. Men too sick, too injured, too broken to work were shipped back to Germany to die there instead of in Soviet territory. Able-bodied prisoners remained for reconstruction work. The Soviet Union had been devastated by the war, 27 million dead, entire cities destroyed, infrastructure demolished. German prisoners were economic assets for rebuilding. Major releases occurred in 1947 to 1948 as Cold War tensions rose, and maintaining large German POW populations became diplomatically problematic. But 85,000 prisoners were retained as war criminals convicted in Soviet courts of various offenses. Many of these convictions were spurious. Membership in certain German units automatically meant conviction. Being an officer meant conviction. Being captured in certain locations meant conviction. The charges were pretense. The real purpose was maintaining a labor force. The final repatriation required highest-level diplomatic intervention. September 9 through 13, 1955, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow for direct negotiations with Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin and Communist Party First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev. Adenauer's visit produced an agreement. Remaining German prisoners would be released in exchange for West Germany establishing diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. This was controversial in West Germany. Many saw it as legitimizing Soviet control of East Germany, but Adenauer prioritized getting prisoners home. The final German POWs returned to Germany in January 1956, 11 years after the war ended, 13 years after Stalingrad. Men left for war in their 20s and returned in their late 30s, having lost more than a decade to captivity. They'd missed their children's childhoods, their wives' young adulthoods, their parents' final years. How prisoners reintegrated into society reflected their captivity experiences and the time they'd been gone.
American-held prisoners returning in 1945-1946 found a Germany beginning reconstruction under occupation. The country was divided, cities were rubble, economy was shattered, but it was home, and they were alive. These men reintegrated relatively quickly. Their American experience often proved valuable in occupied Germany. They spoke some English. They understood American culture. They'd witnessed American prosperity and fairness firsthand. Many became advocates for Western alliance in the developing Cold War. They'd seen both sides now: Nazi Germany's brutality, Soviet revenge, and Americans' adherence to international law. They chose the West based on lived experience. Approximately 5,000 former POWs eventually immigrated to America. They maintained friendships with guards and community members they'd encountered during captivity. Some married American women they'd met after the war. Others simply wanted to live in the country that had treated them fairly when it had every reason not to. Soviet camp survivors faced entirely different homecomings. Those returning in the late 1940s found families struggling with occupation, division, and deprivation. Many discovered wives had remarried believing them dead. Children didn't recognize fathers they'd never known or barely remembered. Parents had died waiting for sons who never came. Physical appearance shocked families. Men returned as skeletal shadows, aged decades beyond their chronological years. They carried permanent wounds, frostbite damage, missing teeth, untreated injuries that had healed badly, chronic illnesses from malnutrition. Psychological scars ran deeper. What we'd now recognize as severe PTSD was common. Nightmares, hypervigilance, survivor's guilt, depression, anxiety. Mental health care barely existed in post-war Germany. These men suffered alone. The 1955-1956 returnees faced perhaps the greatest challenges. After a decade's absence, they returned to a prosperous West Germany engaged in Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Their suffering seemed anachronistic in a nation focused on progress and prosperity. Society had moved on. Families had reorganized around their absence. Communities had rebuilt without them. They were welcomed home, but no longer fit into the lives that had continued without them. Many struggled to find work. Who hires a man in his late 30s with a decade-long gap in his employment history and no relevant skills for the modern economy? Marriages often failed. How do you reconnect with a woman who's been effectively a widow for 10 years? How do you parent children who are strangers? How do you explain where you've been to people who've moved forward with their lives? Some never truly came home at all. They returned physically but remained psychologically trapped in Soviet camps, unable to escape memories of horror and loss. How nations remember these experiences reveals ongoing tensions about World War II's legacy. In America, German POW camps left minimal physical traces. Most were immediately dismantled after the war. Materials were salvaged, land was returned to agriculture or development. A few sites maintain small museums. Camp Hearn in Texas has a memorial focusing on German-American friendship and the positive relationships that developed during captivity. A fountain built by German prisoners still stands, a monument to creativity and humanity amid conflict. Former prisoners even funded restoration of facilities they'd built during captivity, viewing them as symbols of resilience and cultural exchange rather than oppression. American memory of the POW program emphasizes humane treatment, successful integration of enemies into civilized norms, and the vindication of adhering to international law even when dealing with armies that had committed atrocities. Soviet memory is more complex and contested. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union emphasized justified retribution for German aggression. Why memorialize enemy suffering when Germans had killed 27 million Soviet citizens? The narrative stressed that German POW deaths resulted from natural consequences of German crimes. Former campsites in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Siberia have no memorial infrastructure. The mass graves remained largely unmarked. No museums explain what happened, no monuments acknowledge the dead. This absence speaks volumes. The Soviet system couldn't memorialize what it had done without acknowledging systematic brutality that contradicted official narratives about socialist justice. In Germany, memory split along Cold War lines. West Germany established organizations of former Soviet-held POWs that documented experiences, advocated for recognition, and created memorials. These organizations became powerful anti-communist voices during the Cold War. East Germany suppressed similar organizations. Acknowledging Soviet brutality contradicted the official narrative of Soviet liberation and German-Soviet friendship. After reunification, Germany struggled to integrate these competing memories. How do you honor German POW suffering without appearing to minimize Nazi crimes? How do you acknowledge Soviet brutality without vilifying a wartime ally that defeated Hitler? The result has been careful, nuanced remembrance that acknowledges suffering without moral equivalence. German prisoners died terribly in Soviet camps, and Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, killed millions, and deliberately starved Soviet POWs. Both truths coexist uncomfortably.
What do these contrasting experiences teach us about justice, power, and civilization? First, humane treatment of prisoners doesn't require moral weakness or strategic naivete. America treated German POWs humanely from a position of strength, not weakness. The decision to follow Geneva Conventions didn't stem from inability to extract revenge, it stemmed from commitment to values that transcended wartime circumstances. This approach proved strategically wise. Former German POWs became Cold War allies. They immunized German society against communist appeals. They testified from experience about American values versus Soviet brutality. Contrast this with Soviet vengeance, which poisoned German-Soviet relations for generations. Soviet brutality didn't serve strategic interests, it satisfied emotional needs for revenge while creating long-term diplomatic costs. Second, how nations treat defeated enemies reveals true character more than battlefield victories. Any nation can win wars through superior resources or tactics. The true test of civilization comes when you have total power over helpless enemies. What do you choose to do with that power? America chose law over vengeance, organization over chaos, humanity over hatred. These choices revealed democratic values that survived wartime pressures. The Soviet Union chose exploitation over mercy, revenge over rehabilitation, economic calculation over human dignity. These choices revealed totalitarian values that treated human beings as resources. Third, individual humanity persists even within brutal systems. Even in Soviet camps, there were guards who showed mercy, administrators who bent rules to help prisoners, moments of human connection that transcended official policy. Even in American camps, there were guards who abused power, policies that failed, injustices that occurred. Systems create contexts, but individuals make choices within those contexts. The aggregate difference between American and Soviet systems was enormous, but it emerged from millions of individual choices by people implementing policy. Fourth, the effects of trauma echo across generations. German families affected by POW deaths or long captivity carried those wounds forward. Children grew up with absent fathers or men psychologically destroyed by captivity. Communities lost entire cohorts of young men. This generational trauma affected German society's development, Cold War politics, and European integration. The personal became political at national scale. Return now to where we began. Two young German soldiers facing capture, their fates determined by compass direction. One direction led to Stalingrad, Soviet captivity, 93% mortality rate, years of exploitation, possible survival, eventual return to a Germany that had moved on without him. The other direction led to Tunisia, American captivity, 99.75% survival rate, Geneva Convention treatment, relatively quick repatriation, possible immigration to America, and comfortable life. Neither soldier chose which direction they faced when they surrendered. Geography was arbitrary, determined by where their units were deployed, which battles they fought, which fronts collapsed first. But that arbitrary geography determined everything. This reveals something profound and uncomfortable about war, justice, and human nature. Sometimes the difference between life and death, between torture and dignity, between hell and humanity, isn't about what you did or who you were. It's about where you happened to be standing when you raised your hands. The German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad weren't worse human beings than those who surrendered in Tunisia. They'd all served the same evil regime. They'd all participated in a war of aggression. They'd all been complicit in varying degrees with Nazi crimes. But the Stalingrad prisoners died by the tens of thousands, while Tunisia prisoners went home within 2 years. This seems unjust, and in some cosmic sense, perhaps it is. But it also reveals that justice in war isn't about cosmic balance. It's about choices made by victorious powers, about whether nations choose to exercise restraint when nothing compels restraint except their own values. The Soviet Union had every reason for revenge. German armies had killed 27 million Soviet citizens. They'd deliberately starved Soviet POWs. They'd burned thousands of villages. They'd implemented genocidal policies across occupied territories. Soviet brutality toward German prisoners was, in many ways, reciprocal. Germany had shown no mercy to Soviet prisoners, so why should the Soviets show mercy to German prisoners? America had reasons for revenge too. Germany had allied with Japan, bringing America into the war. German submarines had sunk American ships, killed American sailors. German soldiers had killed American troops in North Africa, Italy, and eventually France and Germany itself. But America chose differently. Why? Part of the answer lies in geography and experience. The war never touched American soil. American cities weren't bombed. American civilians weren't massacred. American industry was not destroyed. It's easier to show mercy when you haven't experienced occupation, devastation, and genocide firsthand. But geography isn't the complete explanation. Britain suffered greatly, London bombed, civilians killed, national survival threatened, yet British POW camps largely followed Geneva Conventions. Canada, Australia, and other Western allies maintained similar standards. The deeper answer lies in different philosophical foundations. Western democracies, despite their many flaws and historical crimes, operated under systems that recognized individual rights, valued rule of law, and maintained distinctions between combatants and criminals. The Soviet system, rooted in totalitarian ideology, viewed individuals as resources serving state interests. Human rights were subordinate to collective needs. Law served the state, rather than constraining it. These philosophical differences manifested in how each side treated defeated enemies. When America captured German soldiers, it saw defeated combatants entitled to protections under international law. It maintained that distinction even when dealing with armies that had committed atrocities. When the Soviet Union captured German soldiers, it saw resources to be exploited and enemies to be punished. The distinction between combatants and war criminals collapsed. All German soldiers bore collective guilt and deserved whatever fate befell them. Two monuments bracket this story's meaning. At the former site of Camp Hearn in Texas stands a fountain built by German prisoners during their captivity. They constructed it using whatever materials they could gather, creating a functioning water feature in the middle of a POW camp. After the war, as the camp was dismantled and the land returned to other uses, someone chose to preserve that fountain. It stands today as a memorial, not to suffering, but to human creativity and resilience, to the relationships that developed between captors and captives, to the possibility of humanity even amid conflict. Former prisoners contributed funds to maintain and restore it.
American veterans who guarded the camp attend memorial services there. The fountain symbolizes reconciliation rather than triumph, shared humanity rather than vengeful victory. Somewhere in Siberia, the exact location varies depending on which camp you're discussing, lie mass graves containing thousands of German prisoners who died from starvation, exposure, disease, and exhaustion. These graves are largely unmarked. No monuments identify them. No visitors come to pay respects. They exist in the vastness of the Russian landscape, testimony to what happens when nations choose exploitation over mercy. No reconciliation services occur there. No former guards and prisoners meet to remember shared experiences. The dead lie in silence, their suffering unacknowledged except in historical records and survivors' testimonies. Between the fountain and the graves lies the moral space where civilizations define themselves. The fountain says, even enemies deserve dignity. Even in war, humanity persists. Victory doesn't require cruelty. The graves say, power without restraint leads to atrocity. Revenge creates only more suffering. The line between justice and murder is thinner than we imagine. Both monuments are real. Both stories are true. Both outcomes emerged from the same war, involved the same defeated army, occurred within the same few years. The only difference was the compass direction of capture.
70 years after the last German POWs returned home, these contrasting experiences still pose challenging questions. Was Soviet brutality justified by German crimes? Does reciprocal atrocity constitute justice? If a nation commits genocide, does that forfeit its soldiers' rights to humane treatment? Was American restraint moral superiority or geographic privilege? Would America have shown the same mercy if German armies had occupied American territory, killed American civilians, destroyed American cities? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're intensely practical concerns that affect contemporary debates about detention, interrogation, and treatment of captured enemies. When American forces captured terrorists and insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan, debates erupted about interrogation techniques, detention conditions, and legal protections. Some argued that enemies who don't follow laws of war deserve no legal protection. Others insisted that American values require humane treatment regardless of enemy conduct. These are the same arguments that surrounded German POW treatment in 1943. When we discuss what obligations powerful nations owe to captured enemies, we're revisiting questions answered differently by America and the Soviet Union during World War II. The outcomes of those different answers are clear. One approach created allies from enemies. The other created generational trauma and lasting hostility. One approach demonstrated that military might needn't require moral compromise. The other proved that revenge, however emotionally satisfying, serves no strategic purpose. One approach upheld civilized values during civilization's greatest crisis. The other revealed how easily even justified anger can devolve into systematic cruelty. The German POW experience doesn't provide simple answers to modern dilemmas. The contexts differ too greatly. But it does provide evidence about consequences. It shows that adhering to law, even when emotionally difficult, produces better long-term outcomes than abandoning law for expedience or revenge. It demonstrates that how nations treat helpless enemies reveals true character in ways battlefield conduct cannot. It proves that geography, arbitrary, unearned, undeserved geography, can mean the difference between life and death, suffering and dignity, hell and something approaching mercy. Imagine meeting those two German soldiers decades later, in the 1970s, when both would have been in their 50s. The Stalingrad survivor, if he survived at all, carries permanent scars. Frostbite took fingers and toes. Malnutrition damaged organs. Trauma haunts his sleep. He returned to Germany in 1956 to find his wife remarried, his children strangers, his life irrecoverable. He struggles with employment, relationships, peace, The war ended 30 years ago, but for him, it never truly ended. The Tunisia prisoner thrived. He returned in 1946, reunited with family, rebuilt his life. Perhaps he emigrated to America, married an American woman, raised children who grew up comfortable and safe. He runs a successful business, speaks English fluently, maintains friendly contact with the American farmer he worked for during captivity. When asked about the war, he acknowledges the evil of the regime he served, but also expresses gratitude for the mercy he received. Same nationality, same war, same defeat. But one man's life was destroyed by captivity, while the other's was ultimately enriched by it. This disparity reveals a truth that makes us uncomfortable. Sometimes justice has little to do with what individuals deserve, and everything to do with what powerful institutions choose to do with their power. Neither soldier deserved his fate, good or bad. Neither earned the mercy or brutality they received. Both were caught in historical forces beyond their control. But the nations that captured them made choices. The Soviet Union chose exploitation. America chose restraint. Those choices determined everything. And those choices revealed what kind of societies had won the war. Victory alone doesn't define greatness. How you treat defeated enemies, that's the real measure of civilization. The fountain stands in Texas, testament to one answer. The graves lie in Siberia, testament to another. Both monuments endure, reminding us that when nations have total power over helpless enemies, the choice of what to do with that power defines not just the captive's fate, but the captor's soul. Two surrenders, two fates, one enduring question. What does your choice reveal about who you really are? The compass determined where each soldier stood when he raised his hands, but the captor's character determined whether those hands were met with mercy or vengeance, humanity or exploitation, law or revenge. That choice, repeated millions of times across millions of camps over years of captivity, created legacies that shaped the post-war world and continue to inform debates about justice, power, and human dignity in our own time. The story of German POWs in World War II isn't just history. It's a mirror reflecting our own choices when we hold power over the powerless. What we see in that mirror determines what kind of society we're building. The fountain and the graves wait silently for us to choose which monument we'll create.